Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittany Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by...
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza-Rimas, marriage and family therapist.
We are all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as therapists, who practice out of the Ardent Counseling Center in Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms. And today, for our second Halloween episode, we're going to be talking about Psycho, which is probably one of the more infamous movies out there. It's the famous Hitchcock movie, probably one of the first genuine pop culture scary movies that were made. We're going to be touching upon mostly the main character, Norman Bates, and we're going to be discussing dissociative identity disorder. Also, we call it DID for short. It's the new name for multiple personality disorder. We're going to touch upon how that is similar and different from psychosis, his sexuality, how that plays a part in his DID, conduct disorder, his relationship with his mother, and maybe the possibilities of obsessive compulsive disorder in his presentation. And then we're going to touch upon treatment.
So in Psycho, we want to do a quick plot overview. So this woman who is clearly wanting to be married and having an existential crisis leaves her job at the end of the day after stealing $40,000, which in 1960s is quite a bit of money. And she steals the money and runs off to go be with her boyfriend, gets lost in a rainstorm, and in the classic trope, ends up in a creepy hotel. That's kind of off the road after she has multiple encounters with this cop that's kind of following her and is onto her for being...
She's a horrible, horrible criminal.
Right. She's a very horrible criminal. Got guilt written all over her face, and the cop catches it immediately, making her kind of paranoid. And we kind of see her go through some paranoia and replaying conversations in her head. How might this go? And get a nice insight into where she's at. But then she meets Norman. Norman appears to be this normal-ish...
Like a dork. Like a
guy.
safe dork.
Right. And then we learn pretty quick that Norman is not at all normal. He is spying on her through a hole in the wall in the hotel while she's in the bathroom.
Forgot about that part.
Yeah, that part gives you the heebie-jeebies, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Well, I think the movie does a good job, not to just get into a cinematic review of it, but I think the movie does a good job of slowly leading to the... It slowly takes away from Norman being a nice guy. They do a good job of having the cracks kind of show slowly and one at a time, and in a way that's very well acted by Anthony Perkins, who plays Norman. And I was telling Hannah that I thought it was an interesting choice that they chose a really good-looking guy to play Norman, which I assume is Hitchcock just fucking with people's mentality of that we always assume creepy people look like creepy people.
In the book, he did. He was at least 10 years older, and he was out of shape, overweight, and an alcoholic.
More disheveled, probably. I would imagine that they would portray him more disheveled than he was. Because he was he was handsome and charming in a way. And also, I agree with you, Brittany, that it just seemed like a slow unveiling of who he was, who they portrayed him to be in the opening when you first meet him for the first time in the movie.
Yeah.
Right, and when we go through the film, as he starts to crack, we realize that, he's the villain of the story. You kind of not sure, and you think it might be his mother for a while, because you hear the mother yelling at him for inviting this woman to dinner with him that he clearly finds attractive, and then that becomes a real awkward moment of, sorry, I can't have you over, out of a grown man, which is the first real off-putting thing. You go hold on, though.
Yeah, I think they do a good job of him making him just seem like a weirdo. For lack of a better term. Just kind of regressed mama's boy, odd, isolated dude.
For sure. They definitely do a good job of making him look like that, and they also do a good job of showing him slowly devolve into mental illness when they kind of reveal what's actually going on here.
Mm-hmm.
I think it shows just how socially awkward he is and how you just assume that he seems alone at the hotel, and so you just think, oh, he's just awkward with people. And that's all that it is, really, because it seems like he's alone so much.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but it's not. And we find out, throughout the film, the mother comes into the bathroom when this woman is taking a shower, and it's like the classic shower scene with the read,
Yeah,
that trope
for
that's
sure.
like replayed it over and over, everything all the time. I feel like the score really made this movie like stand out and pop.
100%.
But then we find out later on that Norman is his mother. His mother's been dead for 10 years, and find out he's got a fascination with taxidermy, and that he robs the grave of his mother who has died, stuffed her, and then preserved her body, and lives with the personality of his mother inside himself, which is where we get the diagnosis from.
And we're aware that he is based on a real dude, Ed Gein, but we're not going to talk about Ed Gein because we don't really know anything about Ed Gein other than the fact that he did similar unsettling behaviors and homicidal behaviors and fascination with his mom. And I mean, I guess it gives a little insight into Norman Bates, because I know what little I know about Ed Gein is that his mom raised him to believe that like women are evil, that sexuality is evil, and that to feel for a woman is like disgusting and wrong. And that definitely seems to be a big part of Norman's issues. And in the movie, they pretty blatantly state at the very end of the movie, there's a therapist or a psychologist or psychiatrist or whatever he calls himself who comes in the end of the movie and gives this long expositional ending speech about that kind of just ties everything up really neatly in a ribbon, which was maybe they would have done in the 60s, because as we talked about with Shutter Island, people played it a lot faster and looser with diagnoses back then, and it was a lot more, in my opinion, judgmental back then. Like they would just make slap diagnoses and like put you on Quaaludes or whatever. But he's not totally wrong. I remember remarking upon that. Basically what he says in the end is Norman has multiple personalities. One of his personalities is his mother, that he probably became that personality after she died, and he probably killed her, and he couldn't deal with it, so he became her, and that dynamic caused him to be homicidal with these women, including Marion, and that I should have written the speech down and I forgot, but that now he is fully his mother, because he makes it sound like this was like a really big psychotic break, being arrested and found out, and I guess the reality checking of that his mother's really dead seemed like what that psychologist was getting at,
right?
And because of that, now like he's fully his mother. Norman is not exist anymore,
right? That he couldn't tolerate the reality, which is what really is important when you're talking about dissociative identity disorders. There's usually some sort of trauma that causes there to be a fracture in the personality where one part is protecting the other from information that it can't handle. And it's presented well, particularly for where the awareness of this would have been in the 60s.
Yeah, because, I mean, he does have the classic symptoms of DID. He has more than one personality. Because technically for DID, you only need to have one other personality fully formed besides yourself. They say two or more, but that includes yourself. Well, your actual true self. And you need to have recurrent gaps in your recall of everyday events. So just what you see with him, like he forgets gaps of time, or he seems like he doesn't have any recollection of what's going on when it's his mother.
No, he definitely shows like amnesia of those moments, because when he kills Marion, he as the mother, then he comes back and is taken aback by it, like, oh no.
Yeah. He seems shocked by it, like he didn't realize what happened. And that your symptoms have to cause an impairment in your day-to-day functioning, which it clearly does. He's very socially isolated. It doesn't seem like he's trying to have a bigger life than the one he currently has, which allows him to be very isolated. He's very odd with Marion, so it definitely has impacted his ability to like have a functional relationship with sexuality and with women who it seems like he's attracted to. And it doesn't seem like it's part of a like cultural thing. Like it's not like part of his religion or mythology within his family or culture, which is a distinction of DID. Like if it's part of your culture to become other people or like your mythology, then that's a different, like we talked about with Sixth Sense again. Like if seeing things, hearing things, pretending to be other things is part of your cultural narrative, then that's different than when it comes out of like what's seemingly nowhere, which is like in this movie.
Right. When you're talking about any sort of diagnosis, you always have to take into consideration the individual's culture and background and religious beliefs, even if they're not common religious beliefs. If they are something that is part of that person's culture, it has to be considered as part of your diagnosis before you slap labels on people.
And it does seem to be, I know the titled movie is Psycho, which isn't very sensitive, but so it begs the question of, is he psychotic? Does he have psychotic symptoms instead of having dissociative identity, or does he have both?
Yeah, I think that's like a very central debate around this movie that goes back among this profession probably since it came out, where people are like, because he sort of is displaying characteristics of a couple different things. It's pretty clear that he's got the DID diagnosis. He meets the criteria for that by having the multiple personalities, having gaps in his memory, and having blocks in his time where he can't, his communication with both sides of himself. But when we think about like a psychotic break, you'd see clients who might hear voices and might interact with their internal stimuli, but the difference is that they never become that personality. They may hear a voice. Right, it doesn't take over their body. They might be afraid that it's going to, or afraid that that voice might be real, or that it might belong to somebody who's stalking them, or any number of things. But usually the defining difference is they don't become that.
Right. The people that I've worked with in my experience who have psychotic or who are experiencing psychosis, it almost always seems like the voices are from outside of them, or that they have to create a narrative where the person or people are outside of them speaking to them, and that we just can't see them, or they're somewhere that we can't see or deal with. And so in this, which is what I think kind of goes more towards the, I know that we said he already has DID, but it just seems like he was so enmeshed with his mother, most likely, before, that he is
just totally struggling with her
yeah
being around anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely, to get into like the next topic, like his sexuality definitely seems to play a big part in his break from reality, in terms of switching into his other personality, him seeming to be triggered, because it seems like in the movie all of his quote-unquote fights with his mother, which would be interesting to watch as a therapist, because I think the part of what gave me pause thinking of, is this like a semi-realistic portrayal of DID, is that from what I know, and I have a very big gap of knowledge when it comes to DID, so if anybody out there listening knows more than me, I welcome the knowledge, is that they seem to have interchangeable conversations with each other, which doesn't seem typical, but I could be totally wrong. Because from what little I know of DID, it seems like either one person's in the driver's seat or the other person's in the driver's seat. And I think it's interesting that they talk to each other. But it does seem like all those arguments between his mom and him are triggered by, I assume, him feeling sexual arousal about Marion, like wanting to have dinner with them in the house, and he has an argument with his mother, like just her literally existing around him with like her womanly body seems to really like fuck him up, and to the point of having to get rid of her via his mom.
Yeah, you see that the problems really start when he starts spying on her through the creep hole. Yeah,
which is another interesting, I was gonna say peep. Another interesting like peep into his brain, because that's him doing that, not his mom.
Right. That's
so he
voyeuristic.
has dysfunctional behaviors of his own.
Absolutely.
Which leads into this idea that his sexuality is not adaptive. It's not appropriate.
No, he has not really developed into sexual maturity in adulthood. His mother's preventing him from getting, or his mother's emotional abuse, basically, of shaming him and for having any sort of sexual urges or anything, is it's part of what's in the book and what is in some of the extended series, because there's actually like a Psycho 4. I think it goes quite
and also
deep.
Bates Motel as well.
Right.
Plays a lot into his relationship with his mom and them being pretty enmeshed. And by enmeshed, I mean like when you're a little too involved with each other, like you're kind of up each other's butts, to say it casually in like slang. But it's where you are too involved with each other, and especially at an age, because you've learned that his mom actually died when he was 17. And so our assumption is, based on how he's presenting as an adult, that a lot of this weird sexual interactions with him and his mom happened when he was a teenager. And on Bates Motel, and probably the book, and probably, I know there are a lot of sequels to Psycho, that they probably flesh that out more. And that because I think, isn't in one of the Psycho movies, doesn't he even have like a sex scene with his mom?
I don't know. Maybe
I feel like that
the
was
one with Vince Vaughn?
I think it was still Anthony Perkins. He must not have been making a lot of money after this movie, because he was in some of the, like, Psycho 4, whatever. But I do remember, because it was one of those movies where I think and I might be totally misremembering this, but you know how there's movies when you're a kid that have something kind of naughty in them, so you just remember that you and, like, neighborhood kids used to be like, fuck, this movie has like a dude like fucking his mom. But you know what I mean? But also I could be misremembering of another movie. But I feel like in one of the Psycho movies, they pretty blatantly show or insinuate that he and his mom are like fucking.
Yeah, I think. I mean, and then he makes mention of it, a son is a poor substitute for a lover, which they leave ambiguous, but
a red flag.
It's such a red flag. Like that could mean so many things happen. It could be very indicative of a lot of things.
It also seems like the way that I heard it when he said it is that it had been said to him, is how it felt. Like it comes out in a way that it sounds like it's been repeated to him in some kind of context. That's how it felt to me when it just comes out of his mouth like that. And he kind of has like a pretty blank look on his face when he says that.
Yeah, for sure. And then we hear, like, when the mother is speaking, we hear her kind of shame him for, like, having dirty thoughts and, like, bringing this dirty woman into the house, and, like, how dare you think about, what she's alluding to is sleeping with this woman in his house. Like, what, after you have dinner with her, then you're going to sit alone with her and in the bedroom and
dirty boy.
Be a dirty boy. Right. And so we see that he's clearly been shamed to believe that sexuality is wrong and to engage in sexual behaviors is dirty and false. So he's going to reject doing that. It'll create cognitive dissonance for him, where he can't tolerate the thoughts, so he has to separate from it.
Feeling aroused, and definitely not feeling aroused in a, I don't know, grown-up way, like just flirting with her and just like being regular. Like it seems like any sort of arousal. Well, one, it's interesting that he invites it in via the peephole, like, you know what I mean? It's like very immature. One, and two, it just seems like, I don't know, like he can't tolerate being, I don't know, God, I just keep saying aroused, but he can't like tolerate it.
What I was wondering is, as we were just discussing this, is it that he can't be attracted to anybody else besides his mother?
Or like it's a betrayal?
Is that a betrayal of his promises to her to not ever be with a woman? Like, and not about being with her, but just in general of like, I'm not ever going to be with anyone. I told you that I wouldn't, and kind of keeping a promise to her in some way. And so while he's allowed to look, he's not allowed maybe to do anything else about it. And by him,
feels like
exactly.
He
and by
do
him,
something about it, he's got to take care of the trigger, aka the woman that's making him feel
I think
horny.
I think once he gets reprimanded by his mother, then he has to do an action, because then he knows, it seems like he feels like he won't be able to do anything else unless he gets rid of her.
So what you're describing is an obsession and a compulsion, is it not?
Yeah, I would say so.
I would say so too. I think there's evidence in this discussion, like with what Hannah's describing, of when we see this trigger, it's that he becomes obsessed with this thought of, like sleeping with this woman or having sexual feelings to her, and then because he has them, he has to do something about it. And this is where his other personality takes over and takes care of that for him, because he can't handle it. However, he's been so shamed into believing it's wrong that cognitive dissonance, in this case, since he's already got the DID, triggers a switch of personality to protect him from the dirtiest thing he can do, which is my interpretation of how his mother's abuse was interpreted for him. Like, that's the worst thing you can do. And I've seen that in some clients that I've seen where if they've been forced to believe that sex is so wrong that they can't experience it without on being certain conditions, that they are dirty if they even have those thoughts, and they become guilt-ridden and have an emotional crippled feeling about being a sexual adult. And it's a really actually powerful thing, and parents need to be very careful about how sex is discussed in their household. Like, even if you have religious beliefs that sex shouldn't happen until marriage, like, making people believe that it's dirty and wrong is a whole different thing than going, this isn't something you should do until you are in a committed married relationship. There's a very different discussions, and it can be very traumatic for children to believe that natural urges that every human being has make them dirty, wrong, or in some way broken.
I mean, for sure. I mean, I'm all about sex positivity, especially, and this can be controversial with people, but especially with children and young adults, and especially kids who have had some sexual misconduct in their life, or assault or abuse, because, like you kind of like said, Ben, it can really connect arousal to weird, I shouldn't say weird, but like to atypical
stimuli.
Yes, well, just thoughts in your brain, like deep shame, and like if, let's say, you were sexually assaulted by, let's just roll with it, your mom, or you were in like kind of like that girl from Wilson, like not Wilson Phillips, but from Mamas and the Papas, that Mackenzie Phillips, who had a like quote unquote consensual incestuous relationship with her father. I mean, that stuff happens where people think that they are in consensual relationships with their parents, but that creates such a weird idea in your head, or like just disruptive, unhealthy idea in your head, inappropriate, about what sexuality looks like, and it can connect deep feelings of shame, because even if you feel like it's consensual societally, being in a romantic relationship with one of your parents is not like typical, and it's not considered normal and healthy and appropriate. And so even if you lived in that bubble where you felt it was consensual, there'd be a lot of shame attributed to it by society. And so I guess what I'm getting to is, it can be really easy for you to connect A, arousal, to B, negative stimuli, either like, I'm a bad person because maybe I got aroused when I was being sexually assaulted by my parent or another person. And then, so now when I'm aroused later, does that mean that I'm gross because I got aroused then and I still get aroused now? Like, isn't sex a bad thing? Or maybe, but your body's still going to have arousal even if you've connected sex to like negative, horrible, traumatic experiences. So then there's a lot of confusion about that. Like, how can I even like sex still when that's happened to me? Like, what's wrong with me? Like, that I can still get off? Like, and so it can create a lot of, I guess, for lack of a better word, like neurosis around your sexuality. Like, what is my deal? And Norman's kind of like the worst, most conflated version of that, which is his sexuality is so convoluted for him that he has to become a whole different person. His mom, his like punisher, his abuser, when he's feeling sexual.
Right, because she no longer exists, so something has to take that role, because now there's no one to take that away from him or provide that structure to him, so he doesn't know how to respond to it appropriately. It can be a really damaging thing to instill in someone that sex is dirty, and it definitely can create a neurotic state.
I think it does. I think it definitely does a lot more damage than I think people can realize. That while, religious beliefs are whatever, and you're allowed to have them, there also is a best way of portraying that to your family and to the people that you are around and to your children. And that trying to make sure that there isn't shame and guilt associated with any kind of sexual feelings is really important for if you want your child to have a healthy sexuality, because they will have sexuality. There's no stopping us having, like you said, Ben, any human has sexual feelings and arousal.
It's a primary biological drive for all living species, and religion likes to pretend that it's not, but it is, and if it didn't exist, life would not exist.
Yeah, exactly.
Or it can get the message of, it gets confused in that, like, there's a big difference between having a bunch of casual sexual relationships and then just getting a boner like out of the blue when you're 14. Like, you know, those things aren't connected. Like being sexual in general or like having arousal doesn't mean that you're going to be thoughtless with your sexuality or thoughtless in your sexual relationships in your life. Or even though I don't think there's anything wrong with having casual sex relationships. But that's a big jump between you have arousal to you're going to be inappropriate with your arousal and whatever inappropriate means to you.
Right.
And I think those things are usually connected in a way that's not healthy because you can't help when you're feeling aroused. I know more for boys than girls. I know that from what I've heard that boys go through a period of their teenage years where you will just get boners for no reason.
When you're called up to do math problems at the chalkboard. Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that you're
or the
like...
day of your big speech.
But I think sometimes the message gets sold when sexuality is billed as a bad thing is that you have ultimate control over that, and because you couldn't manage that something's wrong with you. Like you're too horny, or you have too much, or you're too many dirty thoughts, or whatever. And so I think that Norman, like I said, is just like the most blown version of that, and probably because our assumption, all three of us, I think, is that he must have had some sort of enmeshed, maybe sexual relationship with his mom, where he probably felt like it was consensual. Like I was saying before, like he probably, you know, it sounds like with the things he said, like a boy's best friend's his mother and substitute of son's not a good substitute for a lover. It makes me feel like my intuition is that he and his mom might have had what more closely resembled a marriage maybe, or a sexual romantic partnership. And then she got this actual partner and this husband that she acquired, and that must have just fucked him up so royally, Norman. In a way that's, I think, understandable if you were going to be his therapist, especially since he is the younger one in the relationship. So when you have these quote-unquote consensual parent-child sex relationships, it's not consensual because one of them's a parent, and usually those happen when people are younger. And so there's a power dynamic there where probably part of the grooming process or getting the kid to be on board with it is manipulating them into believing that they are equal in the relationships in terms of giving consent and being an equal romantic partner to you as the much older person. And that doesn't always happen. We're talking about parents because that's what we're assuming happened in this relationship. But that's any dynamic where there's a much older person what am I looking for? Being a predator?
Being a predator.
Yes, having predatory behavior.
Yeah, having predatory behavior towards a much younger person.
Yeah. And I think that what is really interesting is I think that part of it, that even if it isn't a full-on like sexual relationship that they're having, it's either something that is inappropriate regardless. Like either there's boundaries being crossed that shouldn't be being crossed.
Of the house in a way that's
exactly. Like in he has a role in the family that doesn't work out, and so because of that, boundaries have to be shifted and moved, and that's part of when you're enmeshed with someone. That means that there's almost no boundaries, and you're allowed to, that you feel more like you're one person. Yeah. Which is also why him having DID with the second personality being his mother really, I think, shows that there definitely was something like that going on when she was...
He didn't know how to literally be without her. So he had to create her to keep functioning. And I can just imagine,
because he doesn't know how to be himself without her.
Yeah. And I probably... We're making a lot of assumptions in this episode because we know so little about Norman before this movie, basically. I mean, the psychologist at the end kind of says some stuff, but that's also kind of assumptions. But it just seems like, I wonder if he felt genuinely heartbroken and betrayed when she got married, because he probably felt like, this is my partner, and now she's leaving me for this other person who's a better fit for her, and now he's going to try to boss me. Because I'm sure there was much more of an equal relationship as well. Yeah. I wonder how much of it was really like a mother-son and more of it like two equals. And so then if you have this bro coming in who's trying to be your stepdad, like that would be enraging.
And also somebody
and starting a hotel.
Yeah, and also someone so then who are you? And how does your identity get formed after that?
A child again?
Who do I become now? And so who am I to you, and how can I prove my worth to you if what I thought our relationship was about was either the intimacy that we had or that you needed me and I needed you, and that's how this worked. And now there's this other fucking guy over here. What is he here for? And what does that mean about me? Does that mean
was
that...
I not enough?
Exactly.
Well, and you think about any time you start a business, that consumes your time.
I like that you're coming at it from the business ending point of this argument.
Well, I mean, I think it's
but have you guys started a business before?
It's a biopsychosocial factor, right? We want to consider the whole thing.
And also,
so, like, but you think about, like, so we find out that when his dad died when he was, what, 5?
5, he was 5.
His dad died when he was 5, and the sheriff tells us, when we find out the mother's been dead for 10 years, that the father left him a considerable sum of money. Which is probably, why he likely, I would speculate he did not go to school. But why they could exist even though they're kind of off to the, off the highway in this isolated house. And then this man comes in and convinces the mother to, like, start this hotel, and I am certain that took away from the time that he would spend together with her, because now there's work to do, and mom can't spend as much time with him, has to have adult discussions, has to build this business with this man, and that's going to take away the time from their enmeshed relationship that he's used to spending all the attention of life focused on him. And that's going to be a thing that he would have issue with, and probably at least part of the reason why he poisons them.
And it makes me wonder if that was an impulsive thing he did because he was so upset, and it makes me wonder if he meant to kill both of them, or if he did mean to kill both of them because he wanted to get back at his mom for replacing him. And then my assumption is that after she died, he was like, "Oh fuck, I don't know what I did, and I don't know how to be without her," which led to him creating this other personality. Because, like I think you said, Hannah, earlier in the episode, DID is usually always formed by a traumatic incident that makes you split your personality in order to cope with it.
Right.
And so my assumption is that happened. I bet he became his mother right after that.
That's probably true. I think, too, also the question that's been kind of sparking in my head is one of the things we wanted to kind of lay out was, do we think that Norman, before any of this, displayed signs of conduct disorder? Which I think, you could make an argument for. I'd probably lean against it. But what we know is that, he has issues with dead animals because he likes to do taxidermy.
Which might be his way of, like, putting his wanting to hurt animals into, like, a safer place. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm thinking. Because one of the defining characteristics...
Not to shit on taxidermists out there. We don't think you're all psychos.
No. Well, we do not.
But in condition with everything else.
Right.
In
this story, like, they show that for a very specific reason.
It makes him unnerving, because it's like, what the fuck? I think it also creates a very eerie setting.
Well, yeah, absolutely. There's these birds in weird positions.
And also it's a way to, like, inform the audience of how he kept his mom's body going after 10 years. I mean, she looked like shit, but... She was not.
She's fucking dead.
But
dude.
she wasn't a skeleton. But I mean, she wasn't a skeleton.
Right, body positivity, Brittany. God.
She still had skin on her. Ew,
Yeah.
that's a sentence I didn't think I'd say today.
Yeah.
But I wonder with his, because I guess the conducty behaviors we see are the peephole thing. So it's like sexual behaviors that, without the consent of the person that it's happening to. So peeping on someone would definitely be a part of that.
Right.
He's violent tendencies, obviously.
Clearly.
The animal thing possible, I can't think of the other.
Right, it's possible.
I have to say that in that scene where he's talking about it, to me it feels like he's definitely created some narrative where it's okay that he has all of these stuffed animals, where it feels like, no, you probably killed them and then stuffed them so you could have them around you and have a reason and have a story about it. I don't know.
He says it's how you fill your time, but I do it killing time.
Right. Well, but I think with
Yikes.
a question that I have that I pose is, we know he has DID and we know he has 2 alters. Did another alter exist that killed his mother and stepfather?
I don't know.
Like a really angry, like rage-filled, hurt personality? That would make sense.
Like a childlike personality, maybe? Or, I don't know.
Or something. There's usually a powerful one.
I was going to say a powerful one who can make the decisions and say, you're not going to hurt us anymore.
Right.
and I'm going to take care of this for you.
And maybe that's why he's so in denial of his mom dying, because he wasn't present
Right.
for that situation.
Right.
I mean, I feel like it'd be watching this movie and just negating Bates Hotel and like the books and sequels and stuff. It would be interesting to get eyes on this kid at like 14, 15.
Absolutely.
Because with the conducty behaviors we see, like the peeping and stuff like that, he seems like, my assumption is he's very isolated. He was probably very isolated with his mom up in that creepy ass house.
Yeah,
he was
suspect
probably
no school.
homeschooled. Yeah, that does sound accurate. Feels right. And then he continues to be isolated, staying at this failing hotel in the middle of nowhere. And I wonder if, I guess the argument would be made, is he conduct, or is he doing these atypical, inappropriate behaviors because he wasn't raised socially? Like, does he not, like, he doesn't know that these, like, he's like raised in isolation, and so, and also his mom is probably not right in the head in her own way, and so was he not taught how to behave correctly? You know, was a lot of these behaviors normalized because he doesn't have anything to compare them to?
That's what I was going to say. Wouldn't that make so much sense that if somebody is kind of raised in the wild, sort of, or only with one person looking in and without any peers, it would be really hard to just be able to assimilate naturally to interacting with other people. So that social awkwardness that we see in the very beginning might be something that's just natural because he's been isolated for most of his, I mean, all of his life. And how would we expect anyone to interact with other people if they hadn't interacted with any other people besides his mother, who it sounds like he took for as like I don't know, the narrator, like the boss of everything, the only person he gets knowledge from.
Well, it depends on what the stories were she was telling him, because if she was normalizing creepy behavior and sexual behavior early on, then he might not know any better than to
use the people.
Yeah, and to like not really get that that's how off-putting that is.
Right.
I mean, there's a secretiveness about it that makes him seem like maybe he does know, but who knows?
Well, in relationships like that, it's common for the abuser to create it's just us narrative. It's an us versus them narrative, and our relationship is special, and we have to keep other people out to create an era of secrecy and normalcy. But I want to pose a question here, going off my theory that the alters developed earlier than when he killed them. Like, it seems to be the story steers you towards, like, the altar was created when he killed his mother and stepfather. However, when we think about how DID cases develop, one of the things that they get developed by is when there's child sexual abuse, right?
Yeah, yes. That's the common narrative.
So the theoretical question I'm going to pose here is, if he didn't know sex with his mother was wrong, would he have perceived that as sexual abuse, where he would have gone into a safe place and maybe created a DID based on that trauma? Or would he not have perceived it as trauma and it been preached to him as normal, and he would have never had that as a abnormal thing be a realization he had, where he figured out he was being abused?
I mean, it'd be hard because you'd have to talk to him about it and see how he... As a therapist, I would talk to him and I would just see... I would see how he talked about his relationship with his mom. I wouldn't make any assumptions, and I wouldn't try to say anything leading or judgmental about his relationship with his mom. I wouldn't put any labels or words on it.
Right.
And I would let him tell me the story of his relationship with his mom, and I wouldn't have any facial reactions to it at all, or I wouldn't make any corrective language. Like, if he started talking about his mom like she was his girlfriend, I would just go, and I would just listen, and I would take that in, because that would be really informative about what you're saying, Ben, is how does he view this relationship? Is he view it as like, this is, like, because if he would tell it to me like that, the assumption would be that he doesn't think anything's wrong with it, and so why wouldn't he tell me about his mom like that? Because isn't that how it is for everybody? Or it's totally normal.
Exactly.
But if he is secretive about it, or if he doesn't want to talk about it, he's cagey, which he kind of is when the detective's talking to him. But if there's like a twitchiness or a evasiveness about it, then it would make me think that he knows something's wrong with what's going on. And even if maybe he told himself a story that it was okay, if he's being evasive, then part of him knows that behavior wasn't regular and okay.
Yeah, I think, and those are all important things to consider. I think it's fascinating to think about, like, okay, maybe these alters developed when the sexual abuse started. When he reached sexual maturity, the alters developed then, because oftentimes you hear, like, people, like they split. Like, no, that person's the victim. I'm the strong one.
Yeah,
and
we have to take care of him.
We have to take care of him, and it splits. And could that have been the moment when it split, and then that person protected him from the stepfather, and that's the person that did the murder in the first place, and then when that alter murdered his mother and stepfather, that he populated a new alter of his mother, and then we see, like, this whole picture come together of this sexual abuse is what started the whole process, as opposed to, like, jealousy, which is what the story kind of tells us.
We'd also have to assess, like, how long has he been having blackouts for, like, for how long in his... Because it might be that he can't really articulate having alters when he was younger, but maybe he could say, well, yeah, I've been, like, I've lost time. Like, I would wake up and I know where I was a lot, like, since I was 4, or as long as I can remember. I've, like, woken up and worn different clothes than I was wearing before. I've been doing in a different room than I was before. And maybe it's little moments that grew, but that's probably, my assumption is that would be more of, like, the data you would get if you were trying to assess how long it goes back. Because I don't really know with DID what the common ages of presentation are. Like, if there is a common thread to how early it presents. Like, if it's atypical to not have a break in your personalities until you're older, or is it... Because a big thing in diagnosing in psychiatry is, like, in terms of diagnosis and behaviors, is a lot of it's age-based. So there's a lot of diagnoses we feel like we can't give until someone's 18 and up. Right,
is when you hear us talk about conduct disorder with him, is that with an adult you would call it antisocial personality disorder.
Yeah.
Or where the term psychopath even comes from. Psychopaths would have antisocial personality disorder.
And probably conduct when they were a kid.
Right.
So conduct is kind of like pre-antisocial personality disorder.
Correct. If those symptoms persist past age 18, it becomes antisocial. But you cannot be antisocial and under 18. It doesn't exist. It's not allowed. That's why it's a separate diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
So what I was wondering, while you were talking about, was his alter created when he was younger? Automatically popped into my head, what about his dad? And was it his dad that was sexually abusing him? And then he died.
Yeah.
So then he already has this powerful alter that's developed based on that. And then the stepfather, what you said kind of already triggered his response of being worried that would happen again. Mm-hmm. And then this protector came in and said, we're not going to let that happen again. We'll take care of this for you. I don't know. I don't know if it'd be too young. Like we said, how we're talking about the ages, and like it might be too young. I'm not really sure if something like that could develop at that age. I have no idea. I don't think any of us have a lot of experience in DID to begin with. So
just
I'm
theoretical
not,
experience.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not a very common diagnosis at all.
No.
It's a hotly debated diagnosis still in our world of psychiatry and psychology and therapy.
Absolutely.
Like, I as far as I know, there's still a lot of mental health professionals who don't necessarily think it's real. And
that's true.
I assume it's one of those mental health diagnoses where either you specialize in it or you don't do it at all, because it's such an intense, specific diagnosis that requires a certain kind of treatment to handle correctly, from what I have read about it. Because like you said, Ben, everything I know about DAD I've read in a book. It's all theoretical. It's all hypothetical.
Right. Yeah.
I don't have any, none of us have any firsthand knowledge or even case study knowledge of someone with DID.
Yeah,
no, not outside of school when we learned about it in classes. So we kind of speculated a lot here on the stuff. We allowed us to kind of go into this land of maybe. But
I said assuming. I think I've said assuming like 800 times.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Assume.
In this episode.
I'm gonna pose one last hypothetical just because I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
By something just popped in my head. What if the alter that killed the mother and stepfather was an alter of his father that he created when his father died, and then the father couldn't handle the relationship of the mother and the stepfather because he already populated the mother. We know he populated one parent. I know this is wild. This is a completely wild thought, but I'm
here for it. Yes, I agree.
It's a very curious thing. Like, could that have happened?
I think that's very sophisticated for a small child.
Sure.
I think that's my only reservation, is if we're assuming
And again,
that the dad was 5. Because the things that
5 when his
that
dad
mean
died.
that mean like that he was 5 when this first personality alter may have been created. I don't know if he would have had the.
But that's the Oedipus age.
But I also wonder.
But I don't think he has the sophistication.
But here's what I wonder,
thinking.
though, is that if it's something that populated, but then was fed by the sexual abuse by his mother.
We're assuming that everybody in this kid's life is also sexually
We do.
abused.
Right,
We do.
we're on a.
Assumptions.
However, all the mythos around this, though, like all the Psychos through 2 through 4, and the retelling of Psycho and the Bates Motel, all of them indicate that the relationship with his mother was incestuous,
or at least skirting it. And he was very much like a romantic partner substitute.
Exactly.
Not really sure how far that went sexually. But I think, which I think sometimes can happen when you're in a single parent household where it's opposite genders, or like at least one parent is gone, where the other kid or the oldest kid will take on kind of like the role of like the missing parent or the missing spouse. Like, I mean, even like...
You become the man of the house now.
Well, like even like a recent
Which is what they
movie
would say.
that's popular right now, like To All the Boys I've Loved Before, the oldest sister in that movie takes on the role of the mom role.
Absolutely.
When their mom has died. And I think, I mean, that's the only reference I have at the top of my head, but I think that can be very common because it's just you're trying to reshuffle the family dynamic. And I think, especially in the situation with Norman and his mom, where there's just 2 of them, it'd be really hard not to treat your child more as a peer just because you're coming home and they're the only person you have to talk to. So if you're venting about work, it would be to them because you're just in the house together. Or if you were like worried about bills, they would see you and maybe they would like, it would be a lot harder. I imagine it would be a lot harder to keep very strict kid-parent boundaries like you would if you had a partner to discuss all this stuff with and to lean on.
Yeah.
And things like that. And I think also it would be a lot, because we kind of saw this in Sixth Sense, is the little kid trying to, like, take care of his mom's social well-being, emotional well-being in a way that maybe he wouldn't feel responsible for if she had a husband kind of taking some of the stress off her shoulders.
Right.
And I feel like that's common in... That can be common in all different kinds of situations of where you have one parent who's mostly being a single parent on their own. Yeah. The other thought that came into my head is that when experiencing grief as an adult and you have a child and you've lost your partner in any kind of way, whether it's, from like very tragic to something that you kind of knew was coming, maybe some kind of long-term illness that they had, that grief can be it's very hard. It's very different for everyone, and how maybe even out of that the mother maybe kind of shifted into this relationship.
Like she needed him to be
She needed him to be that because maybe she couldn't deal with her own grief, and at that time,
lonely and just general loneliness, and stuff like that.
Well, it can create this slippery slope too.
Exactly.
And like when we're talking about like how abuse forms or how relationships get enmeshed or problems. Even when you're talking about how affairs happen, there's a slippery slope that starts where the flirting behavior starts.
There's technology nowadays, so it's like, is texting cheating? You know what I mean? Like, is Tinder swiping cheating?
Yeah.
Yep.
But I mean, like, but it creates
this
a lot more tippy-toeing.
But tippy-toeing, and then what's going to happen is with somebody that's with grief-stricken, they might be more susceptible to compromise their boundaries for comfort.
Absolutely.
Oh, for sure,
and
100%.
So that could set up a slippery slope scenario where like the traditional roles of parent and child could get more blended into parent and partner, which is a whole different set of societal roles that people form. Mm-hmm.
But also in a setting where we think about with them, they're so isolated.
They
couldn't be more isolated.
And they really couldn't be. And how that would have such an impact on the mother having peers, the mother having people that she can lean on. I mean, clearly we're going really far with this, but I'm just saying that, like...
I mean, we can make a wild assumption that the mom killed her husband, Norman's dad, because she was like, now I have this beautiful son, and I only need him. So let's get his other bro.
Absolutely.
So I can swallow him whole like a snake.
Yes. Yes, exactly. So I think it's just, but I think the other thing it seems very prevalent in most of the stories about this story is that they are so isolated and they are so alone, and how different that can make your perception of everything,
right,
of relationships and how you interact with others and with each other, and how, I mean, it would be... It could really you're having your completely own culture and your own little what is it called? Ugh, it's like a sphere. I can't think of it. Doesn't matter. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Go ahead.
But so, what I'm curious about is, like, how old was he when the highway moved? Like, when did the highway move? Because he says it in the movie, I think, but like, they would have had visitors. There would have been people coming that they would have had to interact with, but the house was all separated, and he keeps a very protective stance of it. Like, was that something that got created out of his relationship with his mother, or was that something that he created after he killed her, where he didn't want anybody to find out what he'd done?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, the isolation could just be part of him being able to kind of have a free-for-all for his behaviors. Like, his isolation allows him to do whatever he wants and not worry about prying eyes. And maybe that's why he can be so kind of charming and okay when Marion initially shows up. Like, he is pretty sweet and charming, and he's got a nice smile, and, you know, makes dinner for her, and he's very sweet and kind of pulls it off. You know, she gets a little creep from him, but, like, not too bad. That maybe because he can kind of pull it together for these brief moments, because he's kind of created his sort of paradise, in that he's so isolated that he can kind of live how he wants.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we look at Norman here, we talked a little bit about this before. I want to just briefly touch on it before we start talking about treatment with him. Would OCD be something that could be considered for him, or would need to at least be assessed for if you're working with this client?
He's definitely has compulsiveness surrounding his sexuality. I think that's a good point you made, Ben. I don't know if I would say OCD, just because he doesn't seem ritualistic that we see. I mean, we only really see him...
Does he not, though? What about the murder?
But I mean, like, he doesn't have, like, little rituals that we can tell that he does on a regular basis to calm him down. But also, we only see him in, like, a 4-day period in a very chaotic situation. You know what I mean? So we don't really see, like, his day-to-day routine and the things he does. Like, I mean, I might be missing something. Hannah's giving me eyes like I'm fucking missing something. But I don't know if he presents...
I think you are. I
don't know.
So, what I was thinking is that isn't it always a chaotic situation for him? Because I think when he has his behaviors, he changes into his mother.
Yeah.
And that's part of his obsessive compulsive disorder that he has, is that he can't maintain this, so he has to switch to her, and then he can do what he needs to do. I also think that I feel like he would need to be assessed for it, because to me it feels like there are enough that in my head it matches that he would have certain rituals that he does every day, based on the fact that he clearly already kind of has regular things that he does. I feel like when he's eating dinner and when he probably does his taxidermy, and those are all things where you have to probably have a very specific set of things that you do in order to prepare an animal to be stuffed or whatever the fuck. So
yeah. I guess what I mean is we're seeing him in an extraordinary circumstance where, like, he's being where he's like, Marion's come, he's killed her, he's being chased by the police in a sense.
But
so
I don't think this is the first time he's done it.
No, but I wonder what his day-to-day is like on a days when he doesn't have any visitors.
But how many days does that actually happen? Because I guess what is hard for me is that when he cleans up after Marion has been killed, it definitely seems like he has done it. He's done it before.
But that doesn't make it a ritual.
He knows what to do. I don't know. Does it not? Especially if he kills any female who comes to the hotel. Yeah. Wouldn't it be a ritual that he comes in surprised in his dressed in his regular clothes and is like? But he knew exactly what to do.
Yeah, he didn't. He showed no panic. Like, I don't know.
Not even panic to be scared for himself that someone might hurt him,
or that he might go to jail. He had to know. He knew exactly what to do. He went. Yeah. He moved in a methodical way. He knew where to go. He knew where the swamp was. He knew how to clean up the blood. He knew exactly how to wrap the body up. He laid the shower curtain out in very specific ways. I'm not saying he has OCD, but I'm saying as a therapist to not assess for that would be irresponsible. And it seems like there's set ritual patterns and behaviors, and working a hotel would be natural for that, don't you think? Because the whole day has got to be set up. After a guest leaves, you have to clean the room, you have to get the new sheets, you have to get everything washed.
And also his isolation would also allow him to really indulge in all of his rituals, because there's no one around to stop him from doing, or to say, hey, are you feeling okay today? It seems like there's something going on with you. And so to not have any outside observer of any kind, how much easier would it be for him to indulge in any kind of ritual that he wanted?
Right.
I guess here's my argument, is him doing all the cleaning up. What's the difference between a ritual that gives him relief, because that's usually what that is when you have the OCD tendencies, you have to go through this whole ritual to feel relief from it? Or is that just something he is so methodical about because he's done it so many times, just because it's a consequence of his behavior? You know what I mean? That would be the question to ask him. Right. Do you have to go through this whole process before you feel better? And that's where it's a ritual. Whereas I was just thinking of it as a practice behavior because he just had to do it so many times because he's killed a bunch of people. And so that's the question to ask him, to figure out if it really is an OCD behavior, or is it just something he's done a lot of times. And, but I do wonder, though, if you had a client like this, especially in this very specific situation, I don't even know if you would get to assessing for OCD once you've gone through all this stuff. I think it would be swallowed up by all these other things. And I do think a good clinician would get there with him and would do it in the beginning. But I think, especially because I feel like something like this would be swallowed up by sensationalist clinicians. Oh, sure. That it would not be addressed, I don't think.
I think that part of what feels right about the OCD part of this is that I feel like it makes some of his narrative make more sense.
Yep.
In a way,
he has to go through the whole psychodrama of the whole ritual.
Exactly.
Think about Dexter.
About himself.
I bet you Dexter is based on him at least a little bit. I don't know if any of you watched Dexter at all.
I've never seen it.
I watched it until it sucked.
It did get bad.
Fight me, bro.
After season 4, it got terrible. It should have just ended. Season 4 was perfect, and then it was garbage after that. But you watch, Dexter has to go through the whole ritual. And maybe I'm corrupted because I watched Dexter and loved it. But what Hannah's arguing here is that he had to go through that whole ritual where he, the whole process from the time the woman comes alone to the putting the car in the swamp.
Which would make sense why he got so upset when she started saying things that maybe he didn't anticipate. Things about his mother needing to be hospitalized, or she says a couple other things.
In a nursing home.
Yeah, and he gets kind of really befuddled, and I wonder if part of that is because that doesn't fit with the story that goes along with this complete compulsion that he has about how he is sexually attracted to a woman and then he has to get rid of her.
I mean, I guess it leads to a bigger discussion, which I have no experience in and I have read nothing about, but is the compulsiveness that comes from people who do serial kill. Is that a form of OCD?
So I have done some research on this and definitely took
Personally?
some of the... In undergrad, I was I took a couple courses in criminology and criminal social behavior, and I think 3 different classes in that track that I took, and for serial. Okay, so we just went through you know nothing, but I know something, and suddenly it's bragging. I could say you were bragging about what you don't know. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what cool kids do.
That's exactly how cool kids do. But anywho, I'm far from a PhD in this, but what I can say is that I definitely learned that with serial killers, they definitely show obsessions and compulsions. Does it become the point where it's OCD is a point of debate, but they certainly show obsessions and compulsions where things must be done in specific ways. They choose specific.
Can't tolerate not completing the process of whatever that is.
Right. Once they start, and they get addicted to it, and they keep going.
And they get really upset when it's interrupted. Kind of like what you're saying, Hannah. Like the little I've known, which is more like me reading about true crime, is that in situations where a serial killer gets interrupted in the middle of whatever their usual thing is, there is usually that's when they'll kill for the first time or something like that, because it goes haywire or it's messier than usual.
Right.
Is because they do need to go through a very specific ritual and then feel very like panicked and disrespected when it doesn't go the way they want.
Well, and that can be shown, like, while we're talking about classic movies here, there's a movie podcast, right? Think about one of the most famous lines in movie history and tell me that there's not obsessive and compulsive and it doesn't prove the point we're talking about here. It puts the lotion on its skin or it gets the hose again.
I thought that was just to keep it soapy smooth so that he can wear it later.
But it has to
That's
be
just
within
good
his
skin
ritual.
hygiene, bro.
I don't think so. It's his
you gotta
ritual.
Moisturize.
It's his whole ritual.
You don't want that skin to crack when you're wearing it over your own skin.
Dry. Yeah.
No. Okay, so we've done a lot of speculating, more than we normally do with this, but you don't get a lot of history with Norman. So,
well, and also even though this is based on a real dude and based on a book, it's very sensational as well. And also, it's like 1960s psychology, too.
Yeah.
And so, I think it is the classic, which we've touched on before, of like this cinema mental health, which is like movie mental health.
Yeah.
Which is where they kind of just pick and grab at the things that make the story better. Which makes sense for the movie. Like, it's a very good story. This movie is very good. I was surprised when I found out it was the mom at the end when I first saw it as a teenager.
Yeah, me too.
Did not know that it wasn't the mom. But I do feel like it is. I did like. I would say that the monologue at the end by the psychologist wasn't totally off base.
Agreed.
One thing I did really like is some fucking cop is like, "Was it transvestite?" He does the classic bro line of "We gay," and he goes, "No, he's not a transvestite," and he actually gives a very respectful definition of what at that time they called a transvestite. Now we would. It's called something else, but
transgender.
Yeah, or he makes it sound more of it's like trans,
or
cross-dresser,
depending
like
on
a cross-dressing kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it was very sensitive for that time period how he says it, and how they don't just make it like this fucking weirdo. They actually give it a time of day in mental health reasons.
Yeah,
like they treat it with more respect than you think from a movie that's so sensational.
I mean, the fact that it ends with him giving this mental health explanation about what is going on with this guy, that's a pretty big deal that they would even attempt to do that. And again, I felt when we were watching it together, it wasn't completely inaccurate. I mean, it's not like they were making wild accusations or wild things or all reacting like this is the weirdest thing they'd ever heard of in their whole lives. I mean, it was very like, so this is kind of what the deal is. This is what this would be like for somebody, and it just explaining it.
I would argue that it makes more sense and is cleaner and more realistic than Shutter Island. In the simplicity
yes,
of it.
absolutely.
Shutter Island was a victim of its own, trying to be complicated.
I know, that's right.
And so I think Psycho was good because it's just one clean narrative. But
yeah, I agree.
And I think it's just one of those things where we would just have to know so much more about Norman to really understand where this is coming from. Like, obviously, we'd have to know the whole dynamic. Because another thing, too, which we haven't even discussed, which is his own conversation, is I wonder if he has always been mentally ill. Let's go off of that. Let's say not even, like, sexually abused and having a DID at a young age. Let's say he maybe has some psychotic symptoms as he's young and maybe some delusional thinking. Maybe he created a story in his head of what his relationship with his mother was like because he wasn't in reality. And then when she got an actual partner, he freaked out and had a psychotic break, which led to this DID situation. So it would be interesting, and I don't know if we'd ever have the answer for it because mom's not around anymore, and he's obviously not at what we call an accurate reporter in the business.
Right.
That if we'd ever get a clear look at that. But that's also a possibility. Like, we're vilifying the mom a lot, but it also could have been a situation where maybe his dad was unwell, and so maybe he's just genetically unwell, and he created a whole story within himself about who his mom was to him, and maybe he was always sick, and back then you might not have treated it, and maybe she homeschooled him to keep him away from society and try to just keep him safe as best she could, and then she finally meets somebody and tries to have a regular relationship, and he wigs and kills them both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's another alternative too. So there's,
Sure.
So I guess what we're illustrating in this conversation is that there's so many factors that can explain or add to the picture of a mental health presentation, because we can make a lot of wild assumptions. Like, I would even argue that the weak point of the psychologist is he's making a lot of assumptions about this kid's whole life.
He really is.
And also, he is being told the story by someone who is not even himself right now.
And who contradicts exactly what he told the psychologist in the inner monologue that's going on when the mother is talking at the end.
Like, we're going to be good. Like, we wouldn't hurt a fly.
Or it was Norman that did that.
Yeah, she's trying to tell herself a story.
Yeah.
Or it supports my theory that there's a third alter.
Yeah.
It's very effective, though. That is a very unsettling scene, which they do, like,
and his smile, his acting, his facial acting was fantastic.
They put that little flash of a skull over his face in the last shot to make you kind of unsettled, which is also very Exorcist-y, having flash images.
Right.
But there's just so many factors that could wildly change the whole story of why Norman is the way he is. And it could definitely change who his mom was and what led to him being up to this point. Because in order to treat him, which we'll get into in a second, you have to know what's the root cause. You kind of have to know, like, what's the motivating factors to this split in his personality, this cause for his psychotic symptoms. Does he need to be on antipsychotics because there's a psychosis component to it? Or is it just trauma related? Or is it both? Like, you have to really, in order to treat someone to have the best outcome and prognosis, you have to know exactly what you're treating. And so it would be interesting to try to figure out, as best you can, his childhood history, which will probably be really hard.
Yeah.
Very hard.
And I think as clinicians, just letting, people who aren't in the field know that it's a really hard thing, and we try to be as gentle as we can, but also when people come in and aren't ready or willing to share their whole narrative, that's why it can be hard to help treat someone when they have a hard time being open and honest, but also totally understandable. Coming in and telling a stranger your whole story is very difficult, and not being able to have insight into it is also something else. So as a mental health clinician in general, trying to get a whole picture of somebody is kind of what we're doing the whole time we're seeing someone, and trying to help. But also, that's why it's so important to meet people where they are, because you have to meet them where they're willing to meet you. And if they come in with this one story, that's okay, and we can help them with the things that they want, and maybe at some point make a change, and maybe not.
And I think what's probably the weakest point, I mean, we can just slide into treatment. This will be my treatment. I think what's going to be the weakest point about working with Norman is that he is the only real reporter of his experience left. And he's, one, not connected to reality, just obviously, because he's not always himself. He doesn't remember everything, so he's going to have big patches for his memory for God knows how long.
Well, right.
And also,
have
his perception, and your perception is your reality. Like, I've worked with families, I've worked with individuals, I've worked with adults, where they tell me the story about a person in their life or about their family, and I'm believing them, and I'm like, okay. But then sometimes I'm like, I feel like I'm missing something. Like, something isn't quite making sense. This puzzle's not being put together because... And I don't know why. I'll be working with someone, I'll be like, I got to get my eyeballs on either the husband or the parent or the home. And then once I see the home or the parent or the other partner or whatever, I'll be like, oh, okay, now I know what's going on. Because sometimes, in some cases, like, I'll have a person tell me a whole story about this other person in their life. Like, they're like this, they're so mean, they are always screaming at me, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then I meet that other person and they're chill. And maybe they're a little different at home with the person, and it isn't always because the person that I'm seeing is trying to lie to me or deceive me. They might really feel like this person in their life did these things to them or treats them this way, and it might not be quote-unquote accurate, but it's what they believe is true. And so it can be tricky in this story where obviously his perception is very skewed to really know what's reality and what can I challenge and what can I really process through if it's not. But also, sometimes it doesn't matter if it's reality as long as it's real to them.
Exactly.
It's tricky. I feel like I have no idea how he would present now, after the end of this movie. Like, he is
he's
fully his mother,
blown.
they say, but I don't know how that would if that would last forever. If he's stuck as his mom, then does he... This is also where I have no experience. Would you just, like, try to talk to the mother persona and alter and just be like, what's her motivations? Mm-hmm. He obviously, I'm assuming, would be locked up in a facility of some sort, probably an institution, I would assume. But...
Yeah, I'm sure he would be in an asylum he'd be at a place for the criminally insane at that point.
He'd be at Shutter Island.
Yeah, that's where he'd be.
And I know we talked about
Arkham.
this. We talked about this before we started recording, but he would probably have to work. He wouldn't work with me. He'd probably have to work with a male, because even as the mother persona, they're both of these characters, more the mother, are very threatened by a female, especially a younger female, because I'm in my 30s, Hannah's in her 30s, and so we're around Marion's age, a little older than her, and so we would be a highly threatening, suspicious, slutty person. Yeah. Like, they wouldn't, if I rubbed her the wrong way at all, or said something that was at all challenging, she would probably just write me off as, like, some whore that is the devil coming for her, and maybe even try to hurt me. Yeah. And so then you'd have to have a situation, which we talked about before, Mike, of what would the room look like that we were in. Like, if it was a woman, it'd probably have to have security, and then that adds a level of non-privacy and distrust and aggression that wouldn't be relaxing environment.
I think an older woman would be fine.
Maybe like a peer.
Yep.
Age.
Yep. Well, because clearly the sheriff and his wife had a positive perception of the family. Like, I mean,
they thought that the mom killed the husband, though, right?
Yes, I think you're right. But
so they didn't think they were right.
They didn't think they were right, but they
I think they thought Norman was fine.
They didn't have overwhelming, there wasn't a sense of that weird family.
They said that she poisoned her husband and killed herself, and that Norman found them.
Right. But not until up until that point. It seemed like they'd maintained they were surprised by that.
Yeah.
They maintained that they were a normal family, which means they probably had some interaction with the community.
Yeah.
So I bet an older woman probably wouldn't be seen as a threat. Like we see the younger sexual object becomes a threat. Like someone who is a peer to Norman would be a problem, but someone who is of more the motherly age would probably be able to do therapy with them fine.
Because I wonder, I think you're correct, Ben, because I wonder if there'd be more of a feeling of commiseration, like, this lady knows what I'm talking about, these young whores walking around, like, she gets it. Yeah. Especially if
they're falsies.
Especially if you know going in, and then you can be conscious of how you dress. So if I was an older woman and I was going to see this client, I'd probably wear, like, a turtleneck, maybe a cross, even though I'm not very religious, but maybe I'd pull out one of my old Catholic crosses, wear, like, sensible shoes. Like, I'd probably try to look very conservative, not to manipulate her, but to make her feel comfortable. Absolutely. Especially in a scenario where there's a level of unpredictability that you don't really encounter in real life as a therapist, because this continues the narrative of mentally ill people are dangerous and violent, which is unfortunate. It is unfortunate, because it's not true. And we're going to probably, all our Halloween episodes are probably going to have this topic in it. But
except the next one.
Well, except the next one. We're going to do Halloween, bro.
Yeah, he has conduct disorder. He's dangerous.
Yeah. So, spoiler alert, we're going to do Halloween. But,
he's dangerous.
And so, there is a certain level of more anxiety and maybe precaution taking that you wouldn't normally take as a therapist in a session with a client, where you might alter your image more than maybe you would normally to make yourself safe, to make the situation safe. That might feel more like deceptive than you normally would be, I guess is what I'm trying to point at making.
Well, I think that there is a part of us that we change and shift as the client tells us things anyway. True. My voice gets softer when they talk about something that's hard. My voice matches theirs. Yeah. My physical, the way I'm sitting matches theirs, and how that is part of what helping someone by helping them feel validated is also in a way helping them feel physically validated by the way that we are responding to them. And so I don't think that it's unlike that, really, where what you're really trying to do is try to make the client as comfortable as they can and to trust you as much as they can by presenting yourself in that way, because really that's what our real hope is to be able to build trust with the client anyway. And because part of the buy-in is that they believe that we can help them, and if they don't trust you, they're not going to believe that you can help them. If they don't believe that you can help them, there's a good chance that it will fizzle out and they won't come back.
That's definitely true. And with this particular client, or people with DID, one of the treatments that you have to do is you have to build rapport with not just the client, but the alters too. Like, you have to be respectful, and you have to address them as their name, and you have to address them as different people when they are speaking. Because when that person is presenting, it's another person, and it's not, you can't conceptualize it as a fraction of the person you're talking to. Like, it is a distinct personality that has a distinct function and is presenting for a reason, and you have to address that. And you need to be able to build rapport with all of them if you're going to get therapeutic buy-in, because if there might be a narrative where the alters are having different opinions, where the main core personality would hear the voices having conversation, like the different personalities would have a running narrative of like, oh, he or she can help you, or they're not helping us, we can't do that.
Because kind of piggyback on what you're saying, from what I have theoretically learned about DID's treatment, is that you have to get because the goal, supposedly, is you want to get all the personalities back together.
Right,
take all the fragments and put them together. And how you do that is you have to get all the alters, which is, we call the personalities alters, is get them all to talk to each other and to be in agreement with each other on a common goal.
Which usually needs to be that the person can be safe without them. Yeah.
And so a lot of it is processing, like, the anxieties of each alter, and, like, maybe letter writing.
And the function.
And, like, maybe, and a way it was put in something I read was almost like, and they actually do this in United States of Terra, which is having a contract. There's a scene where whole alters write a contract together, like, around a negotiating table of what their like, boundaries with each other and what they all want together in Terra's body. And it's a really interesting scene. But, I mean, as the child therapist to swivel, topic-wise, man, I mean, here's the thing. I don't know why he would come into treatment as a kid.
He wouldn't.
And he probably wouldn't. Yeah. And the only way I think I'm going to go off the idea that him and his mom have a enmeshed, sexual, inappropriate relationship. Let's say that's what it is. He probably wouldn't come to treatment. I would say the only way that I could imagine it, because one, their whole life is a secret.
Right.
Correct.
And so why are they going to come to a person who's going to blow out their secret?
They would never let that happen.
They ain't going to happen. The only way I could see it happening is, let's say, police get involved, social services gets involved, Norman does something bonkers, and
at school,
and people notice, he goes to school, and they make it a requirement that they have to see a therapist. Okay. And even then, I think it'd be a lot of secrets. I think mom would be up my butt as the therapist. I think she would have a really hard time, this mom specifically, would have a really hard time having me be alone in a room with him where he could tell me whatever he wanted without her controlling it. When you have this, like, secret relationship. And also, I don't know if he would ever tell me, because he doesn't want to, especially if they are isolated like that, and especially if he thinks it's consensual, he's not going to fuck that up by telling me, a stranger. If he's not uncomfortable, then he's not going to fuck it up.
It'd be more likely to slip out than him tell you directly.
Yeah, he'd say something wild, and I'd be like, oh, hold up, wait a minute. He'd probably say a lot of red flaggy things. I bet you would be one of those things.
Me and my mom sleep in the same bed. Like, what? Hold on.
Or like, well, you know,
when we go to bed.
At night when you brush your mom's hair, and I'd be like, say what now? But it probably would be subtle things like that, where I'm sure it probably one of the situations where I was saying earlier, where I know I wasn't getting the whole story, but I couldn't get the whole story. And I'm sure my shoulders, my hackles would be up the whole time, and I'd probably be hearing, like, little red flags, but probably nothing to actually base anything off of. And I wonder how much the mom would be controlling the narrative, either by insisting upon being in the room with me, or calling me, blowing me up in some context, wanting to talk to me before and after sessions, being very disruptive in some way or the other with me, as in, like, maybe even like vilifying me, like accusing me of things, or like manipulating her child or something where it would make it unsafe for me ethically to continue to work with them, which would fuck them up if it was like court mandated or something, because then I could blow up their spot. But
I feel like that's the only way you would see them,
really shut
because
down.
I don't think that she would say that it was okay for him to be in treatment.
Nope.
Yeah, no.
Which
She would
when
never
I worked at an elementary school, part of the only way we could ever see the kids is if the parent said that it was okay. And if the parent didn't say it was okay, there was nothing that we could do about that.
My assumption, they would have to be dragged to therapy for some reason outside of their control.
Yeah.
And that in therapy, it would just be bullshit or shut downness until they had to stop seeing me.
He literally wouldn't talk.
Because it'd be one of those things where maybe they have to see me 10 times. Or maybe they had to see me until I said I had some findings. And I bet you I wouldn't have any findings. They'd be inconclusive, or he'd put on some bullshit face. Or they'd have a whole act they'd do with me.
Yeah.
And I would just...
I think that's likely.
And I wouldn't... I might
feel
like
cases.
I might feel like something's wrong, but I wouldn't have anything to back it up.
No, you'd have to base it on like you'd have to do play type, depending on what age he came in.
I kind of have to sneak it out.
You'd have to sneak it out, do play things, or do drawings.
Therapy and drawings.
Where you could see like why don't you draw a picture of what things are like at your house at night, or like how
you act out with the playhouse or a dollhouse.
Right, you'd have the dollhouse, or like, and just kind of let the kid's unconscious kind of portray what's actually going on, what's normal for him. Like, well, what is okay, so let's say that this character is the mom and this character is the son. Like, what would they do during a day? And just kind of leave it open-ended, and you would get some insight that way. But as far as like direct questioning or anything like that, you'd get defensiveness and probably not parental consent.
Well, like the sand tray therapy, which is where where it doesn't have to be a mom and a son. It can be
and sand tray therapy is literally a tray of sand.
It's just a tray of sand, and then usually you have a lot of different things you can put in the sand, kind of just like it's just like a sandbox, and you can pick out a bunch of different things and kind of make a scene, and show something instead of drawing. It's pretty similar to drawing, but it could be like a mom horse and a son horse, or like it doesn't have to be people, because I think sometimes, and the things that I've heard about it by sitting in lectures about play therapy, which I've done a couple of times, is that a lot of times kids tell a story that is not about humans. It's about it can be about animals.
That's
definitely
true.
Some play therapy with kids, and I've done sand tray and animals. Kids really like. You're right. Kids really like working with animals, especially littler kids, like I would say 10 and under.
Yeah.
And they'll usually more inclined to pick up an animal and start making like a mama pig and a daddy pig than human. That's definitely true. And I don't know if it's like, I'm sure there's stuff written about it that I haven't read, but
same.
I don't know if there's a certain like just like a protectiveness about talking through an animal versus a person, or if it's just the imagination kind of going with it. And like, because the concept of play therapy is that the kids using their natural play to kind of like their subconscious through play is able to work out what's going on with them. And so the idea is that there's not a lot of like conscious thinking when they're doing it. They're just kind of working through via their play. And so maybe that's just how it naturally presents, like, the phenomenon of using animals instead of people.
And also, I think... Also, if a child is threatened in some way by a parent or by someone who's a primary caregiver, by saying, you're not allowed to talk about our family, you're not allowed to talk about us or about me. So the kid's like, okay, well, they didn't tell me I couldn't talk about dogs or kittens or monsters or anything, so I can talk about that, and I can tell you any kind of story about a monster.
Yeah,
because
for sure.
That would. So I think that's part of it.
There's a lot of thinking, and it's been years since I've touched upon this, but a lot of play therapists, licensed ones, do a lot of drawing work, and there's a lot of thought about almost like testing through drawing, and the way you draw a horse and the way you draw a bush and the way you draw this tells people, it almost feels like a psychic reading. Like, will tell you a lot about what's going on with the person, and there's a lot of rules around it.
Absolutely.
And so that could be a way to go about it. Like, hey, I want you to draw me a horse. And I can't remember what it means when you draw it a certain way. Like, it means something if you draw it straight on versus to the side versus 2 legs versus 4 legs. Like, all that means something psychologically, which I cannot recall.
Yeah, house tree person would be helpful too.
Yeah, house tree person. That's a big one. And it means something if, like, your person's on the ground versus in the sky flying. Like, all this stuff means
if there's
something.
windows, if there's doors. I bet
if there's hatching on the roof.
There'd be no windows in that house, I bet you. If the house he drove, there'd be no windows because they wouldn't want people seeing in. I bet you.
But it would be
one way to get in and out.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so I think you kind of have to go. I think you're right, Hannah, in that it might be helpful, even if he was an older kid, like 15. Yeah. It might be helpful to do play therapy, because technically play therapy can be interesting and informative and helpful with every age, not just children.
That's true. That's definitely true. So we kind of talked about a kid. If we were to get Norman as an adult, if I were to encounter him, I'm going to say if I got him before the murder happened, because once we got to the point where the mother takes over, we have crossed into a plane where I have no experience on what might work at that point.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to talk about before he's gone in the murder. But I would honestly, I would want to try hypnosis, and hypnosis is one of the preferred treatment methods for DID. And what I'd want to use with hypnosis is something called an age regression, which is where we would regress him back. Once you get him into trance state, which one of the misconceptions about hypnosis is that it's putting in people in another state, that it's unnatural, that it's someone else is surrendering control, and none of those things are true. You won't do anything under hypnosis that you would normally do. It's a state of relaxation. It's kind of getting into any kind of trance state, and a trance can be loosely defined. It's not someone is gone and willing to accept all suggestion, but it takes you into a different mindset is really what it's helping you do. It's a more relaxed mindset where you're going deeper and down into your subconscious a little bit. But when you do an age regression through hypnosis, what you would be doing is allowing him to go back and get in touch with memories from a time before he needed his mother's personality to take over. You'd make, what was a time when you remember when life was okay? And you would take him back to a time of that, and you might be able to ask questions. Someone who's more skilled in it, I have just recently gotten trained, so I haven't taken the advanced courses yet where you would cover more of those things. But you would want to get him to a point where you could find the strengths that he had and start figuring out what point and what triggered this break. Like, when did it happen? You might take him back to a time before Dad died, a time before Mom and Stepdad died, and regress it back to go, like, what happened? What was different about life then? What are some of the things you notice? And because when you do hypnosis, in order for it to work properly, you have to be extremely permissive. People get this idea that it's the same as stage hypnosis, where someone's giving you commands and telling you to do things, and it's not at all like that. It's very permissive, very relaxing. It's more like guided meditation. And creating this safe space where you're permissive, allowing, like, maybe you'd like to go back to a time when you felt safe. Maybe you wouldn't, but maybe you'd like to think about a time when you felt you were safer, you were in more control, and you can notice some things. And one of the things about hypnosis is that when people are in hypnosis, they're less prone to talk and less suggested to. So you don't have to encourage them, and you can talk about it. But I think that would be one of the things that I would want to see is work on an age regression with him to bring him back to find a point where he didn't need the alters, to see kind of where they formed and how to reconnect that part of his mind together so we can figure out a way to bridge them together.
And it would be really informative for you to figure out when he started fragmenting.
Right.
That'd be really interesting. And see how far that went. And if there was like a directly preceding incident that we wouldn't know about before.
Right. And the other thing that you need to do with DID is that we've talked about kind of about reintegration, is you have to find a way to make them believe that they don't need the alters anymore and that the core personality can be safe. And it would be figuring out what the function of each alter is, how it ties into keeping the core personality from being unsafe and in danger or hurt, even emotionally, and figure out how a way to convince them that they don't need that and they can reintegrate. So that would be where I would go.
You could do are you gonna do Hannah, like couples therapy with like the mom and him?
Oh my god, I don't know. I'm sitting here thinking like, oh fuck, like I don't. It's so originally, before we kind of talked about this and kind of where we've ended up is kind of different than where I thought we would be. But also, what I was really thinking about is how family therapy is really rooted in working with people who have severe mental illness, who have schizophrenia, who have psychosis. And that's kind of where family therapy started, because they realized that there was such a correlation made in the environment that you're in and how it influences everything and how that's part of treatment. And so that's kind of what I came in with, like, oh, I'm going to talk about the history of marriage and family therapy. But now it kind of feels like, man, fuck, I don't know. I feel like I was thinking in my head about how maybe seeing them after the dad dies,
like when he's little,
when he's 5, and having the mom come in for like grief, right, and maybe talking to her about, just to see what it would be like to have her come in, and because she's seeking assistance for grief, which she wouldn't do, and this would not happen for sure, but have her come in and talk about that, and then really be able to talk to her about the different roles and how it's going to change, and how I wonder what I think I would try to do is try to see her with her son and have them come in and be like, and maybe have them make a story together,
like,
and kind of who are they now, and help them develop their identity and see. And I don't know if, again, because we don't know about about whether or not he had always struggled with mental illness even as a little boy. And then I think finding that out and then shifting and changing to help the family really understand what's going on with Norman, and how really opening up that window for the mom and giving her psychoeducation about this. I mean, I think that's a whole different story if we start there. I don't know if, I mean, clearly I don't think they would come in, but I think that would be part of what I would try to do, is just help them really connect, and also help them to define their identities after the dad has died. And because it seems as though part of her experience of grief has a big impact on whatever happened to Norman. Yeah. And so seeing her and seeing them as a family after that happens, and helping them grieve and helping them find new identities after the dad is dead, I think might change, has the potential to maybe change the outcome of the story for Norman and his family and his mom.
Well,
sure,
change their relationship and get eyes on the situation early of, is mom depending too much on her kid in an inappropriate way? Like, is she leaning on her child, who's very young, for comfort in a way that's not healthy for the child?
Right, and you'd want to work with mom on appropriate boundaries and learn to recognize the slippery slope thing, and not that necessarily, like, I know we talked a lot about, like, the likely abuse in the story because of what exists in the collateral material, not because we're speculating, but because that's where the story actually goes.
Yeah.
But we'd want to talk with a parent about that's lost their partner about the slippery slope of making sure the child is still a child and not a surrogate partner.
Indeed.
And not that most parents who go through that will sexualize their child. I'm not saying that, because that's not true.
It's more
we want to make sure
like
we're clear on that.
Adulting your child.
Right, adulting your child, or sharing your adult problems with the child at inappropriate ages for a child to know such things, or
just knowing
to
too much
deal with
and
things.
Being responsible for your feelings too much, and not letting them be a carefree child as much as they can be after their own grief.
Right.
Like, that's more of like making sure your kid has their own space to not worry about you, kind of.
Yeah, and allowing a child to grieve in the way that they need to, in a way that's appropriate for them too, because grieving as a 5-year-old, as a child, grieving your parent, versus an adult grieving for their partner, are two kind of pretty different things.
Yeah.
And so really helping them understand that, and I think that's what would be really important, just because it's such a change for everyone. And how are we still a family, and what do we do to either honor that we had someone else who is in this family, and what do we do about that? Or do we need to honor them? And how do we, again, I think it's a lot more often that it happens where it's just the adulting of the child, because it's kind of a slippery slope, like we've already talked about. I think one of the other things that I would really suggest to the mother would be, what about a support group for parents who have lost? Because having peers who understand you and who are at the same level, who maybe also are parents,
huge.
I think that would make such an impact, again, and maybe change the story for Norman. But obviously we can't know.
Or even just being like, who are your same age peers?
Yeah.
Do you have girlfriends? Do you have married couples who knew both you and your husband, so they remember him, and you can, use them as like someone else who's grieving? Or like, you have siblings? Do you have family in general? Like, trying to steer the support away from the child and to a more reciprocal,
Yes.
age-appropriate relationship with someone who can shoulder some of your grief in an appropriate way. I mean, and like you said, Ben, like, it obviously wouldn't lead to necessarily sexualizing your child. My continued assumption would be that she probably was sexually abused herself if she would go there. Usually, if you do it to someone else, it's been done to you. And so that would be maybe my assumption is maybe she comes from a family where there's a lot of slippery slopeness in terms of sexual boundaries and maybe some sexual shaming and puritanical views, and everything's gotten convoluted and it's just kind of and then when her and Norman isolate, it just blows up. So
yeah, I mean, I'm sure that her sexuality has been, you know, I don't want to sound like a dick, but like tainted in a lot of different ways. Because here's the thing. If we're under the impression that Norman has this sexuality that doesn't really match up, what are the chances that his mother also doesn't have a sexuality that has been formed in a natural way?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, I think there's a pretty good chance that has also happened for her, and how that's very common.
I think so. So with this episode, we've done a little more speculating than we typically do.
We normally do, yeah, for sure.
And, you know, we generally
But I think it's a lot of different interesting topics that if you hear one of these and want to, like, educate yourself more on it, it'd be really interesting. Deep dive.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's a deep dive, and also like with this story, like Norman Bates is AFI's number 2 villain of all time. Like, he's a classic cinema figure here, and there's been a lot of case studies on him in schools, in textbooks, for cinema and for psychology both. There's been a lot of work done on Norman. Norman's a fascinating character, but some of the ancillary materials, Psycho 2 through 4, and
Bates Motel 100% is about him and his mama's relationship. Right. You know, her name is Norma.
Yikes.
Yep. Norma and Norman. Yep.
I don't like that.
So, I encourage you to take a look at some of the mythos of Norman Bates, and you can learn more. It's like one of cinema's greatest villains. But as far as this movie, what are you guys' final thoughts on it?
I think it's a really well done movie. I think it's, like I said, I think the beauty is its simplicity. You know, it's not super complicated. It's just this one guy in this one house who's not well. I think I appreciate the old school cheesiness of it. Like when the one dude, Abergast, is murdered down the stairs and like, ah! As he's falling backwards very dramatically. Yeah, for sure. But, I mean, I think it's a classic. I think it weirdly holds up. For how old it is, especially since it is mental health rooted at the end, it holds up.
Yeah, I think it definitely holds up. I think it's a great film. I think it's set so many of the tropes, and Hitchcock's directing work in it. It's become so classic that it's been repeated through movies over and over. And some movies, any movie about DID, like, will almost invariably have like some kind of scene at a hotel that looks just like the Bates Motel. Like the movie Identity is
like that full blown.
Is like that full blown, and it looks like this new movie. I'm not sure what exactly it's about. I haven't seen it, but the new movie about the hotel that's kind of split between California and Nevada.
Bad Times and El Royale.
Yeah, I suspect that there's going to be some callbacks to that in this, but this movie I think still holds up, and I very much enjoyed it. I thought it was great. Does it do a great job of depicting psych as is? Questionable, but it certainly, for the time and how it was understood then, is excellent.
Yeah, I think that it's a really good movie. It was really fun to watch. I had never seen it. I think we've already talked about it before. I don't really like scary movies. But I think it really held up. And I think, again, with the endings being so rooted in actual psychology and what they understood at the time, I think it's pretty accurate for that time and also had a good portrayal. So I think it was a good movie. And I think the editing in it was just masterful. It was just a really, like, from that point of view of the director and the way that it was set and shot and just really brilliant acting by, Anthony Perkins. He
was so good.
So one thing really quickly is there's something called where we describe someone who's struggling as labile, which is where they're kind of vacillating between being enraged and being okay. And he does such a good job of showing what that struggle can be for people
and how quick that shift
how quick the shift happens because of whatever is going on with you inside. And so again, I think it's a good movie, and I think it holds up. I agree with you guys.
All right, so That's going to be the end of this episode. Be sure that if you guys have thoughts or questions, you guys hit us up on Facebook or Instagram, or you can email us at popcornpsychology@gmail.com. We're popcorn_psych on Twitter and Popcorn Psychology on Facebook. Thank you guys so much for listening, and be sure to stay tuned for our next episode on Halloween.